at 9, ER at 9:30 and Banzai at 10:30. So if you missed them during the week, you can't really be giving out now, can you?
To people in medieval Britain, the natural world was mysterious and threatening. They believed it was the battleground where God and the devil fought for their souls. Magic and superstition were staples of everyday life. But as the 18th century approached, the mood was beginning to change.
What people are coming to realise is a world picture which depends upon an all-out war between God and the devil is actually too destructive, too anxiety-ridden and too profitless to be worth keeping up.
For 100 years since the Reformation, people had lived in the shadow of religious fundamentalism and persecution. In that period, prejudice and dogma had triumphed over reason and tolerance. It had led to civil war that had raged for almost a decade. Now, something new was happening.
It's the decline of the idea that all things have a sacred association and that the universe can be controlled by sacred means, be that magic or going to church.
With hindsight, we can see that this new mood was a revolution. The darkness of ignorance dispelled by inquiry and reason. The start of the modern world. One man above all others can be said to have laid the foundation stone of the Enlightenment in Britain, Isaac Newton. He was born in this farmhouse in Lincolnshire on Christmas Day in 1642, the year the Civil War broke out. It was here he took refuge 23 years later, when the Great Plague struck London. In a barn beside the house, there is an exhibition of simple scientific experiments. So much of what underpins our lives today was first discovered or explained by Newton. Everything in nature fascinated him. What holds the universe together, how light works, and of course, why an apple falls from the tree.
Now, does anybody know what Newton was most famous for? What was he most famous for?
Discovering gravity.
Discovering gravity. And does anybody know how he discovered gravity? Yeah?
The apple dropped on his head.
He was sitting under a tree, and an apple fell off the tree and hit him on the head. And he wondered why the apple didn't just fly off into space. Why did it hit him on the head?
Newton arrived at Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1660. At this time, Oxford and Cambridge dominated the intellectual life of Britain. The monarchy had been restored after Cromwell's rule. Politics and religion were less lethal than before, but still in turmoil. Newton, the great mathematician, is today considered to have begun the process of reducing God's influence in the world. But Newton himself wanted to use his extraordinary skills to see into the mind of the supernatural being who had created the universe.
For him, there is a single, paternal, divine principle which created the world and runs it from moment to moment. And it is our duty as believers, as people who are created by God, to study the works that God has made.
Though Newton believed passionately in an all-powerful God, he did not see him as a capricious conjurer. He believed the universe was based on laws and principles, which man could, with careful observation, uncover and prove.
God is the creator, not only the creator of the universe, but actually the fine-tuner, the mathematician who made some quite exquisite calculations about the speed at which each planet just had to be flicked at creation to ensure that it went into a stable orbit round the sun. So one's often tempted to say that Newton saw God as a kind of mathematician, a little bit better than himself.
Newton's picture of God is that in the beginning of all things, God created a number of what he called active principles, which live in the world and are at the heart of every particle and are the cause of fermentation, acidity, light and fire. And if we could understand and master those active principles, we would understand God's purposes.
At this time, all over Europe, scientists, or natural philosophers as they were called, were engaged in a ferocious debate over the role of God in the everyday workings of the world. Was God interventionist? Could he be summoned by prayer to alter the course of every tide or harvest? Or was he a designer who had created the world to tick over like an intricate machine and had now retreated from its everyday operation? In 1686, Newton completed the work for which he is most famous, Principia Mathematica. In it he demonstrated clearly how gravity attracts one body to another, on Earth or in the heavens. But he still found a place for God in his calculations.
The gravitational force is a bit of a dilemma for Newton. He can show with great mathematical precision what kind of law this force will succumb to. What is the law that controls the gravitational force? He can express that with great precision mathematically. But how this force actually operates in nature does remain something of a mystery for Newton. One idea is that the gravitational force is an expression of God's direct activity in the world. It is, after all, an invisible force. Then there's a view where he says, well, the gravitational force is something that God added to matter at creation. But what he always resisted was the idea that the gravitational force was an innate property of matter, because that would have been a materialistic doctrine and really out of kilter with his own particular form of religious devotion.
Newton tended in his chats with his disciples to say it's simply a direct effect of God's action. Now this went like a lead balloon in most of Europe, so that some of his enemies, like the great German philosopher Leibniz, thought that this was simply to make the world a permanent miracle. If the world works as it does simply because God is constantly having to maintain things, constantly having to inject gravitation into the world, and constantly having to keep it in good mathematical order, then the world that we see around us is not rational, but miraculous, not natural, but supernatural. The world was not a machine, then, that had been wound up by God and then ran on in a law-like, regular, mathematical, predictable way. The world, rather, was full of activity and life and vitality, into which God constantly had to inject activity and active principles, otherwise it would run down and stop.
Mathematics and miracles, matter and God. That is the paradox of Newton. The Cambridge academic establishment to which he belonged stood on the cusp between medieval and modern. The religious turmoil of the past decades was too fresh in Newton's mind, and the church too important for either to be ignored.
Newton left thousands and thousands of manuscripts in which he tried to work out for himself how the church ought to be organized, what is the proper role for priests and bishops, what happens in the Mass, how did the church go wrong, what did the Reformation really mean. These are matters of life and death, literally. These are matters of life and death for Isaac Newton, as they were for many of his contemporaries and many of his friends.
Less publicly, he was also obsessed with mysteries like alchemy, or whether the Bible contained secret messages. Alchemy was the pinnacle of natural philosophy, a sort of magical inner sanctum where the spiritual essence of matter could be explored.
The really surprising thing about Isaac Newton is that he dabbled in spirits and conjured angels. But that wouldn't be surprising to them. It's more surprising to us because we have got comfortable with our clear definitions between what is religious and what is magical and what's scientific. In the 17th century, nobody was a scientist, they were natural philosophers. That's to say, they were interested in the philosophy of nature, but this wasn't a secular philosophy, this was a divinely ordained philosophy. And so that what we would think of as being the pioneers of early science thought of themselves as working in what they would have called the providential tradition. That's to say, what they were primarily interested in was uncovering God's secrets.
It's often been said that magic played an enormous role in Newton's thought. I don't agree. Already by Newton's time, the distinction between natural magic and natural philosophy is beginning to be made, and he's distinctly on the natural philosophy side of things. Newton's alchemical project, which is precisely to master the active principles which are within matter and make it move and live, that's entirely consistent with the idea of a single God who has created a single world in which there is activity and life.
Even before he died in 1727, Newton's work was being reinterpreted. What mattered most to him, the role of God, was significantly reduced. Instead, people focused on laws that worked without God.
We see a move from a much more nuanced account in Newton's original, which sees God as fine-tuning his creation, as intervening, towards a view which is much more closely allied to what became deism, which held that God's presence in the world and in history was not that of an interventionist God, but merely that of a God who had set the rules, who had provided human beings with the tools, particularly the tool of reason. And after having set up laws, then God had very little to do in the world itself.
So in the end, Newton's achievement was not to underline the power of God. Instead, he launched the age of machines. The children playing with experiments in the master's farmhouse today have inherited a passion for machinery that started in the 18th century as a direct consequence of Newton's work.
One of the most fascinating achievements of Newton, or at least of his disciples, is the invention of public sciences. From 1710 onwards, we begin to see what I think is the first large-scale public education campaign around natural knowledge. This is new, and that it's unprecedentedly large-scale, and that it comes hand in hand with machinery.
People were engrossed with these new ideas and would hear from visiting lecturers the practical results of what Sir Isaac Newton had achieved.
The way Newtonian natural philosophy was taught was by machines. So that if you went to your local coffee house, what you'd mainly see was machines. You'd see the most amazing colours projected by lamps through lenses and prisms. You'd see strange balls moving round and round circles and clocks driven by pendulums and springs. All these things coming out into the countryside, mainly from London, are disseminated extraordinarily fast through a remarkably large section of English society.
This is what made Newton's legacy so important. Religion and magic had once solved ordinary people's problems and helped make sense of their world. Now, machines began to do the job instead.
We've got a very conventional image of the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution as secularizing processes from above. But it's very important, if we're thinking about religion in England, to think about what they mean from below. The very fact that people could, say, buy buttons and pins and cheap newsbooks and things like this meant that, in fact, that subtly that their consciousness was being transformed.
Industrialisation was changing the landscape. The world we know today was starting to emerge. And nowhere was this felt more than in London. The capital was alive with a new way of thinking about the world.
1 in 6 people in the 17th century spent some time living in London. And of course, that London was a temple to secularism, writ on the largest scale. And in that kind of environment, it's very hard to concentrate solely on a world which was created and expanded and totally controlled by God. What was happening in London might be happening with God's permission, but it was certainly being built by man. And I think that this idea, perhaps subconsciously, was tremendously seductive and made future generations ultimately believe in a kind of progress which God might, I say, approve or disapprove of, but not one in which he was entirely in control.
It was a shift of perception that launched the country in a totally new direction.
One is looking at a world which is beginning to industrialize, beginning to mechanize itself, beginning to fill its rooms and its workshops and its factories with more and more complicated mechanisms whose virtues are often attributed to the truths of Sir Isaac Newton's philosophy.
And the new question for churchmen? What place did they have in this rational, industrial world? What place for God, let alone magic? By the second half of the 18th century, Britain was moving away from being a pastoral agricultural society. A world of machines and industry was beginning to emerge. And the critical connection between human existence and the forces of nature was being broken.
What machines are all about is regulating time. They begin to produce a world which is less closely linked to seasons and to creation. Time begins to take on that rather artificial quality, which perhaps it has for us. So one begins to have faith rather in clock time than in seasonal time. Time is embodied in the regular rotation of human-made machines. And this becomes an extremely important symbol of new ways of thinking about order. It's no coincidence that in many portraits there is a clock sitting there, which stands for mechanical, orderly, artificial regularity. We need to ask, why is it that it became even vaguely plausible that the world is a machine? That question's normally asked by focusing rather on what people knew about the world, but we should really focus on what people knew about machines. And what they knew about machines was that they looked as though they could imitate the world. They could do stuff which up till then only nature, and therefore God, seemed to have been able to do.
It was an astonishing liberation. If machines could do the work that once only God could do, then the trick of life was to build better machines, not spend more time praying. And if theologians thought God was a master watchmaker, then people could forget the devil and trust their hands and their brains. Writers like John Locke encouraged people to believe that God's love was reasonable, not vindictive or violent. The religious wars of the previous century seemed a long time ago.
The great shift between believing in an all-out war between divine forces to believing in the world as a mechanism that's wound up by God and ticks over is not the result of key thinkers who come forward and have the new ideas. It's the result of a change of mind by a whole generation.
The old superstitions now existed mainly in the countryside. They were redundant in the newly industrial towns. For many ministers in the Church of England, witches and the devil began to seem like relics of a bygone era.
By the 18th century, in the wake of the writings of John Locke and others, what one sees is a disenchanted world. A world in which miracles had stopped, and there were no, as they would have said, embodied spirits, in which it was stupid to believe in witches, and above all, a world in which superstition started to take on the meaning that it now has for us.
In this mood, the purpose of life changed, at least for the better off and better educated. No more talk of happiness in the next world. They wanted to create it in this world, now. Most remarkable was a group of talented men from the Midlands who called themselves the Lunar Society. They celebrated their mission each month when the moon was full, and staggered home happily in its light when their meeting was done.
You have Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles, Matthew Boulton and James Watt, who developed the steam engine, Joseph Priestley, a leading radical and dissenter, and others who cluster around them. And they're all mad about science and invention, what we would call technology. And all of them believed that they could experiment and they could invent to make the world better.
They built canals and factories, developed steam power, made fine china for the masses, and even invented soap. They were the can-do world personified. No more disembodied theology. This was practical science to make life on Earth more enjoyable right now.
What is different at the end, as it were, of the lives of the lunar men is both an increase in, as it were, material standard of life for many people across the country. But there's also the feeling that it's the start of a new age, a real age of industry, and this is going to change the way people live.
The New Age saw the rise of a new class. Out of the glow of industry came people who were neither tied to the land nor to the establishment. They were the first entrepreneurs.
Although we think this is a sort of rational, dry age, in fact, one of the most thrilling things is to see the sheer wonder with which people looked at things that were new.
New processes, the production of steel or the power of steam, were evidence of the boundless, miraculous potential of life.
This was astonishing. This was actually like seeing something which people had thought was divine power being manufactured in front of your eyes. But it was also like a revelation of real powers in material things. When, for instance, they discovered that you could release carbon dioxide, you could release gas from chalk. This is mind-blowing. The horizons of what you could do just expand infinitely.
Until then, gases in chemistry had been called spirits, in a conscious cross-reference to the supernatural forces that religion recognized. The Lunar Society's chemist Joseph Priestley was uncomfortable with the word and wanted to remove it from both disciplines. He started with science.
Priestley sees the need to eliminate the word spirit from chemistry, just as he wishes to eliminate it from theology, and it is a rather interesting parallel. When Priestley is doing his chemistry, he is looking at what he conceives to be material objects. And therefore, as objects, they're part of God's creation, but they don't carry any higher religious meaning than that. So in his chemical language, the word spirit is deleted.
Theologically, Priestley saw no reason to believe in disembodied spirits either. The problem was that Priestley was also a minister of the Unitarian Church. Even in this tolerant age, that was too much. A challenge to the very concept of the soul, and he didn't stop there.
In his purification of Christianity, he was very anxious to expunge what he saw as superstitious doctrines. And one of those superstitious doctrines was that God can act directly on the human mind. So that would be an example for Priestley as an obsolete and superstitious doctrine. So he becomes a very interesting figure in that he sees science and his own rational religion fighting on the same side against all forms of popular superstition.
This chemist-priest personified the revolution that had been taking place. The triumph of reason had become a challenge to the whole edifice of religion.
At the time, Priestley sought to revise our understanding of matter and spirit. Of course, his philosophy would have been felt to be extremely dangerous. I think particularly because the idea of a separate mind or a separate spirit or a separate soul was often linked in people's minds with the idea of immortality and some kind of life after death. And so if one challenged that spirit world, it could seem like a blow against the fundamentals of Christianity.
Even without the iconoclastic priestly, for some in the church, the new thinking had already gone too far. Industrialisation was altering the entire nature of community. People brought up in country villages found themselves crammed into urban streets. Without the old certainties of their parish church, they felt rootless and insecure. But then came someone who understood their need. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. For Wesley, the Church of England had become too reasonable and God too distant. Without spirituality, religion had become meaningless in itself and to its faithful.
Wesley himself seems to have been a man of quite extraordinary charisma, enormous physical presence. He was very far from being enormous himself. He was a very small man, but he was a man who seemed to be amazingly full of energy and very fertile in ideas, a very, very eloquent speaker who spoke simply and directly, spoke to the hearts of people. That was very much at the center of his language. The heart, the emotions, the understanding that comes from that matters at least as much as the intellect to Wesley. He sees himself very importantly as a devout member of the Church of England who's trying to revive it, to bring back its spirituality, which he feels has been lost in years of complacency.
The atmosphere in one of Wesley's Methodist halls was probably like a meeting of charismatics today. In 18th century England, the old parish boundaries of the established church hadn't been redrawn since the Middle Ages. Thousands of factory workers in the sprawling new towns had literally no church to go to. Wesley and his local preachers filled the gap, geographically and spiritually.
In Wesleyanism, you get warmth. I think this is a word that comes up again and again, warmth. You get, as it were, the outpourings of the Holy Spirit. You get inspiration. You get much more congregational involvement, much more hymn singing, much more people making declarations of their own belief.
Wesley's evangelism seemed like a throwback to the medieval church, with all its trappings of magic and the supernatural. His sermons invoked hellfire, damnation, spirits and angels. They tapped into that vein of consciousness that the light of reason had left quite untouched.
There is a very strong charismatic component to Methodism, which of course is quasi-magical. John Wesley would never have admitted this, but of course John Wesley believed passionately in witchcraft, because there was the greater fear than the possibility that witches might not exist. The greater fear is that one would do something which somehow let the devil off the hook, and that if one were to demote the devil in his power, then of course the fear was that then one would allow the devil's dominion to spread across earth and set back the dominion of Christ.
The success of Methodism didn't go unnoticed in the Anglican Church. Not for the last time in its existence, many churchmen started to ask whether their increasingly tolerant church and its distant God could ever touch hearts and minds in the way Wesley did. On a deeper level, they began to question whether belief in God and the rationality which drove the Enlightenment were actually compatible.
Many 18th century Anglicans thought it was fatal fully to embrace what the new philosophies were teaching. Many, on the other hand, were themselves new philosophers and would not have seen it in those terms at all. So large numbers of mathematicians and astronomers in 18th century England are priests in the Church of England. Most professors in Cambridge University in the 18th century, those teaching the sciences, are priests. They don't see a fundamental tension between rational knowledge and the truths of the Church. The reasonableness of Christianity is an article of faith for them. But the tendency to split passionate Christianity, the Christianity of Easter, from reasonable Christianity, the Christianity of Newtonianism, gets stronger and stronger. And that tension between evangelicalism and reason is constantly in play right through the 1700s and through the 1800s as well. Those two images of English Christianity remain, I think, incredibly important for what public worship means, right through to our own time.
The triumph of reason had transformed both the landscape and the culture of Britain, but it had also uncovered a contradiction at the heart of orthodox religion. While the Church now existed in a rational world, its appeal was to the irrational inside us. That contradiction was to become ever more profound in the century ahead. Britain in the 19th century was a thriving industrial nation. Religion still played an important role in society, but most people now saw science and technology as the principal tools by which human happiness was created. But it was the next challenge to the supernatural presented by reason that went to the very heart of belief itself. This is the house where Charles Darwin wrote his monumental book on the origin of species. Charles Darwin was the grandson of Erasmus Darwin, the Lunar Society trailblazer, so inquiry was in his blood. From childhood, Charles had been fascinated by all living things.
It was part of the Enlightenment project to explain the world by natural laws. So Darwin says, well, we've done it for physics, we've done it in astronomy, we've done it for geology. We don't believe that God or miracles explains the phenomena there. Why not do it for the history of life? Why not discover the laws by which living things come into existence? He called that zoonomia, which was the title of his grandfather's famous evolutionary book. And he went to work on this knowing full well that that's where all the people he wanted to impress most, his Cambridge clergymen, professors, and elsewhere, drew the line. You don't touch that. It's beyond explanation. God brings things into existence by creation.
It was almost by default that Darwin broke that taboo and found himself in middle age writing his iconoclastic masterpiece. His father's plan had been for him to study medicine, but Darwin found he couldn't stand the sight of blood and decided instead to go to Cambridge and train to be a minister in the Church of England.
Now, that was not a conversion experience for Darwin, or his father for that matter, who sent him. This was a recognition that in the Church of England you could believe what you wanted to believe, you could have a nice guaranteed living, you could perform natural history work, do the things that Darwin liked to do. It was a very easygoing, kind of corrupt, unreformed Church of England that Darwin had set himself to join.
Many academics at Cambridge were also clerics, and Darwin was certainly a Christian. But he remained more interested in natural history and lacked any clear sense of direction. Then came the chance that changed his life.
Bang out of the blue comes this offer to join the Admiralty ship HMS Beagle to go to South America and survey the coastline. Darwin jumped at the opportunity and he was off for 5 years, age 22. This was a boy's own adventure. And Darwin realizes at this time, I've got 5 years ahead of me. I can really do something of permanent value for science. And of course, for the glory of God too. He believes in God, Bible, Anglican religion in the way he had always done.
Gradually, he decided that he would not take on that clerical career. He says there was no particular spiritual crisis. It's as if studying the natural world just became ever more absorbing, to the extent that he eventually couldn't face the thought that every Sunday he would be delivering sermons. And when he was in South America, of course, he saw luxuriance of the tropical rainforests. He found wonderful fossil bones. He was just captivated by that world he could explore.
Darwin had several shattering experiences on the Beagle. The crucial one was when he met real savages, as he called them, real barbarians, for the first time at the southern tip of South America. Here were young men, his own age, naked, painted, with greasy hair, grunting, pulling faces, speaking something he couldn't understand but he felt was almost like the sounds animals make. How could one and the same God have created these people and sherry-sipping Anglo-Saxons like himself, who sat at high table at Cambridge? How could one and the same God create them so different? He had to explain this. In his secret notebooks, where he confided his evolutionary speculations, he believed that by netting all life together, making us all related, not just primitive people and black people and Anglo-Saxons like himself, but all of life. It was a deeply felt humanitarian vision. And that, I think, is what gave him his moral compass at this crucial stage. He was involved in a grander project, liberating life from the shackles of traditional Anglican creationism and elevating us all as God's creatures, netted together.
But Darwin sensed he was sitting on a time bomb. He was afraid that if he published his theory, it would be pilloried by everyone in the academic world who still assumed that humans were God's special creatures.
Only humans, according to Orthodox theology at that time, had souls. You couldn't give all animals souls. That's ridiculous. We use animals, we exploit animals, we experiment on them, they die. We eat them. How can they have souls? But if we're all alike, then either they all have souls or none of us have souls. And Darwin's theories would have been accused the latter. Darwin is teaching that humans are nothing but matter. And if they're nothing but matter, then they don't survive into an afterlife. And if there's not an afterlife, then there are no eternal punishments and rewards. Therefore, why should we behave ourselves in this life? We could have a revolution. Darwin knew this perfectly well because he saw people persecuted who went public with views like he held. He had to sit on it.
And so it was that Darwin and his family retreated to this house in rural Kent. For 15 years he was tortured by doubt and sickness. He continued research for his theory, but called himself the Devil's Chaplain. Finally, he decided he must write it all down.
Being Darwin, wanting to convince the world and all these people he was afraid of, he decided to write a huge book. And he got 250,000 words through it when a letter came in the post. And this letter contained a theory which looked exactly like his own. And the bottom dropped out of his world.
The letter came from Alfred Russel Wallace, who'd actually been working for Darwin in the Far East collecting additional specimens. Darwin now knew that he must publish his theory of evolution or risk losing his place in history. He could no longer bottle it up in his study in Kent. He wrote furiously for 18 months. On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, though its full meaning took time to sink in.
The Origin of Species didn't create the ruckus that Darwin had always feared publication would bring on his head. Darwin didn't mention human ancestry except in a throwaway line, didn't say anything about apes in The Origin of Species. But very soon the apes got center stage. Everyone knew that at stake in any account of the origin of species was human ancestry. So the things Darwin didn't say in The Origin of Species, people quickly drew from it. They drew out the implications. A soulless humanity, man only an animal, man therefore not immortal, all hell can break loose.
It was a mark of how tolerant the church had become that even among the clergy there wasn't uniform hostility to Darwin.
There's that theological insight among certain clergymen that Darwin has actually done Christianity a service. Despite an initial shock and surprise at what was being proposed, some claim that Darwin was actually giving them some new insight into the nature of creative processes and therefore ultimately insight into the participation of God in the world. Late in the 19th century, the Oxford theologian Aubrey Moore put it rather nicely when he said, under the guise of a foe, Darwin had done the work of a friend, liberating Christianity from superstitions, which it no longer needed.
Nonetheless, Darwin had raised a fundamental question about Christian belief.
There was anxiety because the theory offered an account of how nature could counterfeit design without there being some kind of designer behind the process. So what he's done, in fact, is removed that image of God the magician, the God who waves the magic wand, and lo and behold, we get the new form of life.
But Darwin himself didn't think his theory meant a denial of God. He did become an agnostic, for quite different reasons.
He never renounced the Anglican Creed, but he did finally reject Christianity when his favorite daughter, 10-year-old Annie, died at Easter in 1851.
Her death was the crucifixion of Darwin's hopes. After the loss of Annie, I think Darwin finds it very difficult, more difficult even than before, to accept that there is a beneficent God who could allow such an innocent child to suffer. It raises a profound existential question. I don't think Darwin could ever come to terms again with the possibility that there was such a benevolent deity who could have acted in that way.
While Darwin sat grieving in Kent, the man who had prompted him to publish was on a spiritual journey too. Wallace also rejected Christianity, not in despair, but in hope.
Wallace and Darwin were never singing off the same hymn sheet. They had different understandings of nature and of religion and, I think, of evolution from the very start. So you might say they almost crossed like ships in the night in 1858, 1859. And then they just went their way again and got farther and farther apart.
Wallace had a vision of nature striving to create a classless utopia, while Darwin saw evolution as a constant struggle for survival. At the heart of their argument was a dilemma which had been growing since the Enlightenment began, and which the debate about Darwin's book had brought to a head. If human beings are not specially created by God, in his image and likeness with moral souls, then what is it that makes us feel special?
Wallace was taking the view that the human mind has certain characteristics, one of which is an aesthetic sensibility, the way we can appreciate music, the way we can appreciate art. These are characteristics of the human mind which he doesn't think are integral to our survival. And the reason he gives is that they're not uniformly distributed among the human race. These are attributes which you find far more highly developed in some than others. Therefore, they have to be accounted for in some other way. Wallace seems to believe that this superintelligence guiding the evolutionary process is an intelligence with moral purpose.
Faced by the dilemma of wanting the supernatural without believing in God, Wallace turned to the increasingly popular spiritualist movement. Spiritualism had a wide following, and among its recruits were many like Wallace, who wanted a scientific explanation of the supernatural.
It attracts educated people of the scope of Wallace. But part of its interest is it has a very strong cross-class appeal. If you're a scientific thinker who's lost his faith, then it's very interesting. It might even be utterly persuasive, perhaps even particularly persuasive, because you have some kind of yearning need, and this fills the gap. Equally, if you are a fairly uneducated, working-class artisan, it has exactly the same appeal, because it's an empowering philosophy that teaches you that you can be your own medium, literally. You can be your own minister.
Looked at from one point of view, those kinds of spiritualism are just a joke, because they involve people holding hands round mahogany tables while implausibly dressed young women pretend to commune with Scotsmen or Red Indians or someone from beyond. But what lies behind that, surely, is a sense that religious institutionalization was in trouble, and that new methods of mediated connection with the spiritual realm were required.
Alfred Wallace's interest in spiritualism caught that mood precisely, and he wasn't an oddball. On the hallowed lawns and waterways of Cambridge, home to the cream of British theology and science, spiritualism had suddenly become a matter for serious inquiry.
It's very popular amongst a scientific community for whom their religion is actually a very important social part of their lives, and also a very important emotional side of their lives, but for whom Darwin and all the scientific changes before and after make it impossible for them to take the Bible literally in the way that they were brought up to.
And in that vacuum, spiritualism flourished. It was in Isaac Newton's own college that the Society for Psychical Research was founded.
They attend seances, they hire mediums, they conduct surveys to see the number of people who have had some kind of supernatural experience. They do a huge hallucination and apparition survey using what they consider to be tried and tested scientific methods. They are continuing with the progress of science, but in a slightly different direction.
It's a very English idiosyncrasy that organizations like the Society for Psychical Research of the late 19th century managed to recruit very large numbers of the leading scientists of the day, so that, in fact, most of the leading physicists of Britain in the end of the 19th century worked on, tested, experimented on, or in some cases took very seriously psychical phenomena and spiritualist seances. And one can hardly understand that unless one sees how powerful the idea of occult forces remains within English national culture.
Magic was back on the agenda, and now it had a more serious purpose.
Magic is reborn in the 19th century, partly as a branch of psychology. Until the 19th century, a lot of ritual magic was a glorified branch of room service. In other words, you're trying to get supernatural entities to obey your needs, to provide the things you're missing in your life or the things that are wrong in your life. From the mid-19th century, that's still going on, but it's linked to an idea that magic consists of transforming yourself at some profound spiritual level.
It was an extraordinary conclusion to more than 2 centuries of change, since Newton began using mathematics to explain the work of God, scientists in his own university pursuing spirits, serious people up and down the country trying to commune with the dead. The next century would give us even more detailed scientific explanation for our bodies and our world. But still, belief in the supernatural, God or no God, would stubbornly refuse to die.
And next week at 8, we look at how the supernatural continues to thrive in our modern world. Now, a 5-day New York extravaganza has come to an end for Graham Norton, and the best bits of his entire trip stateside come next.